Hello, everyone. It's exciting to be back for a midsummer session of the Learning Salon. We are very delighted to be joined by Neil Lewis Jr. today, whom I'm going to introduce shortly. As usual, John has his mic on still, but you know.
I always get this wrong.
We are very excited to be here, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm just going to remind you that the Learning Salon used to be a weekly, but now we're on the summer break forum for discussing contentions and bridges between biological and artificial learning. We typically gather a crowd of neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, computer scientists, and AI researchers, and discuss together these different sort of dimensions. Hi, Maxted. And it's always wonderful to see our student members ask questions and be active. Please remember that you can ask your questions in the Ask a Question area right underneath. There is a button underneath the screen. And in the chat, you can ask your clarification questions. If you would like to be invited to the screen in case your question gets voted highly, please also indicate you can indicate that, or you can say, ask for me if you don't want to appear on the screen. And we will remember to vote on each other's questions, and then the people with the most voted questions will be invited on screen. In the chat, we will do our best to address any sort of clarification questions. And please, if you are from a different field or if you're a junior scientist, do not hesitate to ask clarification questions. At the Learning Salon, there are no wrong questions. We especially want to make sure that junior researchers or interdisciplinary folks who don't know a lot about other fields ask as much as they can, or people who are more shy to ask questions in regular settings, which is why this is a format where the talks are short and the discussion later is very long. So feel free to interact. People usually drop links in the chat. Do that as well if you want to sort of share your other sources with each other. With that said, I'd like to invite everyone to make sure to obviously engage with each other intellectually, and disagreement is always welcome, but it has to always be with respect. So we invite everyone to respectful and honest intellectual interactions without fear of either judgment or challenges. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce Neil. Neil Lewis Jr. is a behavioral intervention and meta scientist at Cornell University in Weill Cornell Medicine. And he's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and in the graduate field of psychology. He's also a science communicator at 538, and he also has an interdisciplinary background with a BA in economics and psychology, and then his MS and PhD in social psychology. Niels's questions are always very interesting because they always link psychology to the real world in one way or other, whether it's in terms of understanding and interpretation or whether it's in terms of interventions. So the three main research areas that he concentrates on are how they interpret and make meaning of, how people's social context and identities influence the way that people interpret and make meaning of the world, their motivation to pursue their goals, and the implication of these processes for individual and collective outcomes. He's also very active about education, which is something that's quite wonderful. On the side, he really likes to take hikes, cook, and take photos of nature, and generally relax outside of work, which I recommend everybody do. During the pandemic, we're all exhausted. Most of us are burned out, so I hope everybody takes a rest. Before we start the session about what we learn from where we live, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge the devastating events that are happening in Afghanistan. 3 of the big cities in Afghanistan have fallen to Taliban following the exit of the American troops, and it doesn't look good. UN has asked Afghanistan's neighbors to keep their borders open to refugees from Afghanistan. And speaking of education and caring about public policy, I am dreading, and honestly, last night I lost sleep about what is going to happen in the future of that region, especially to the education of women and girls. So yeah, I hope that if we have any Afghan viewers, our empathies are with you, and I hope that you reach out to your friends because this is a very difficult time to digest. On that note, let's go back to a more positive note, which maybe not that positive necessarily, and see what Neil has to say from the perspective of social learning about what we can learn about from where we live. And I would invite Neil to share his slides, and the screen is yours.
I think it's there. All good?
It's kind of doing the circle thing now, and now it's there. Perfect.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Ida, and the rest of the organizers for inviting me. I hope you're all safe and healthy and hanging in there in this year that continues to be eventful in not always the greatest ways. So what I want to do today is briefly go through some slides talking about some of the work we've been doing in my research lab on how multiple dimensions of inequality and social systems end up affecting what we learn, how we perceive the world, form judgments, and make decisions that have important societal consequences, and then look forward to the discussion with all of you. So to start off with some background, a lot of my work over the years has been examining the psychological consequences of living in a segregated society. So throughout American history, we had, and in many ways continue to have, a legal system that segregated our nation by race, by ethnicity, socioeconomic status. If you're less familiar with that history, I highly recommend this book by the historian Richard Rothstein on the color of law, The Forgotten History of How the Government Segregated America. So that's sort of how this nation started, and other nations have similar histories as well. Hello. So that's how the nation started. In many ways, that's how this nation continues to operate. And we can see that in a few different ways around the country. One way that you can see that is by looking at data from the US Census. Census has been in the news again the past 2 days. One of the things you can see with the census is you can map where people are living in the US, and all across the country you see patterns like what you see on the screen now, and that is we still have high levels of racial and economic segregation. So this map that's on the screen is of the city of Baltimore. There you see clear divisions between white neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, and the like. Baltimore isn't the only place like that. Many American cities are like this today. If this will advance. Hello. Here's a map of Philadelphia. We see the same kinds of patterns there. You see the same kinds of things in Detroit, which is actually the first place I began paying attention to these patterns when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. So seeing these patterns around the country has sort of led me to ask some broad questions about how do these forms of segregation and stratification that are a result of our laws and policies enter our minds and affect the way that we think and feel about each other. How does it affect the way that we make decisions as individuals as well as broader collectives? And what are some of the consequences of these things for many of the outcomes that we observe in our society and our ability to change those outcomes if change is desired? So that's what we've been studying across a number of domains. I'll just briefly summarize some of the work. In education, we've studied how this affects the way students think about schools and whether they feel like they can succeed there. Thoughts that matter for motivation, persistence, and success in the educational journey, as well as for the effectiveness of different kinds of intervention strategies aimed at improving equity in educational outcomes. It not only affects the way that students think about education, it also affects the way that adults think about education systems and how they should be structured and even funded. So one of the big reasons for education disparities in the US is that the segregated nature of our country has sort of led to differential funding of schools. That's one big thing that happens. And so one solution that economists and other public policy folks often talk about with addressing education disparities is to try and equalize school funding. So there aren't such stark differences in the resources that people have to do their jobs. For some people, that seems like a good thing. But for others, they see this as sort of a different form of injustice, as sort of a threat. And that is, many Americans like the idea of funding schools equally, but vehemently oppose it then when they feel that doing so takes away resources from their own kids' schools and the like. So living in these different places shapes our perceptions of who is deserving of what resources, and that ends up shaping some of these decisions. This matters not only for thinking about education, but also our thinking about health. So we've also done work on how it affects the way that people think about whether health behaviors are for people like themselves, and thus their willingness to engage in different kinds of health behaviors in a variety of contexts. Thoughts that, again, matter for how we go about intervening to improve health equity, both in the context of past health conditions, as well as in the contemporary health crisis that we're seeing now, in the COVID-19 pandemic, that tends to be, once again, compounded by these other forms of stratification. So we have to think about these links between the contexts in psychology to understand how people are going to think about these things and respond to them. Again, it's affecting not only how people think about engaging in health behaviors, it also affects sort of the attitudes about policies that can address health issues. So there's been some interesting work in this space looking at how where people are living shapes their thoughts about health policies, including things like support or opposition to the Affordable Care Act, function of who they think is going to benefit from these policies. Is it people like themselves or people not like themselves? That turns out to affect policy support in that realm. The third area, as I mentioned, that we've been doing research on these issues is in the environmental realm. So, and here the story is quite similar to what I've been talking about in education and health. People live in different kinds of places that have more or less exposure to environmental hazards and other social conditions. And that affects the way that they end up thinking about environmental issues. What even counts as an environmental issue in the first place? So some of the work we've been doing over the past couple of years has been looking at how, again, the stratification by neighborhoods affect people's environmental experiences, has downstream consequences for how they mentally represent those issues. But they not only affect our individual understanding of environmental issues, they also affect our willingness to sort of reach across group boundaries to build diverse coalitions to address some of these issues. Again, if we think those other people don't share the same values or have similar viewpoints, even when they might actually have overlapping viewpoints, then we are less willing to reach across the aisles, reach out, and we miss tremendous opportunities for collective action. But overall, what we've been learning is that this sort of segregated nature of our nation and our social institutions has had this tremendous power that ends up seeping to our mind, affecting what we learn about each other and how the world works. And that's the sort of quick overview to sort of set up the discussion. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion. I will stop sharing screen so that I can see everyone.
Thank you. I think this is one of those rare sessions where I feel like I wish you had more slides.
Try to keep it short for the beginning, but yeah.
Yeah. So I think you might be our first social psychology speaker. Oh. And I think that it would be fantastic to start having these discussions, especially since you and I have worked a little bit on how we can use computational approaches to these kinds of social psychology questions. Mm-hmm. And it would be fun to talk about that a little bit. With that, and knowing that since it's the summer, probably the session will be a little shorter than usual, I want to ask John to start his questions. You're unmuted. You're good.
Okay. Hi, Neil. Yeah, so I have an American passport, but I didn't grow up in my formative years in the US. And then, I moved here and, I feel like I've been getting an education ever since. And I still have that strange inside-outside feeling when I see, I read the Rothstein book, for example, and you just can't quite believe what you're reading. right? Because of how, you know, you know, there's this belief that, oh, some things happen by accident because people aren't perfect. And, you know, I was listening to an interview about the 1619 project and the way that there's a gloss on everything that you're researching, that, oh, well, people aren't perfect, they mean well, wrong turns are taken, but let's look at the positive side, and, you know, we can let bygones be bygones, and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, work like yours and others shows, no, this was systematic, this is methodical, this was deliberate, this was done on purpose, right? And so, you know, getting my education and reading about all that, and I was wondering how much you are subscribed, especially because you talked about education, you talked about the environment, you talked about health. Do you think there is a kind of master trope when it comes to the American political psyche and its cognitive state of mind, that it just has fundamentally, ideologically, cognitively a race problem? In other words, it was there at the beginning, and it actually informs almost every major decision. Because for us from Europe, when it comes to gun control, when it comes to healthcare, you know, how can you not want affordable healthcare? How could you not want gun control? What are you talking about, right? And people go, I just don't get it. And then you slowly begin to realize, well, there is an explanation for it, right? There is one, right? That actually it was because I don't want disbursements to go to Black people. I don't want to be felt that I'm in danger from Black people. I don't want to live next to Black people. And so it seems almost like a fundamental trope. And I was wondering if I could be so bold as to ask you that, am I wrong, or is it not true that it seems to be the engine of so many of our problems in seemingly disparate areas of what one should just be sensible about, and we seem to be constitutively incapable of being sensible about? And it's this fundamental trope. Is that an exaggeration? Am I overstating it?
I don't think you're overstating it. I think, you know, even in the founding documents and the debates that were had at the beginning of the nation's founding, there were all of these discussions about how we should count different people. Do we count them as whole people or some fraction of people? These are decisions, deliberate policy decisions that were made that sort of from the beginning made these different calculations about how much different people are worth, and therefore how worthy are they of different things that the society might produce. And so, you know, this connects to one of the things that I didn't mention we've been working on. We've been trying to think about some of these ideas computationally. When you start from one set of parameters that are that sort of pulled apart, how long might it take you to overcome some of these foundational biases? That's one of the things we're trying to work out. But I don't think you're overstating the case by saying that those initial legacies do get passed down, right? And that's part of why it takes so long to make changes. That's not to say that no progress is made. Surely we've made a lot of progress as a nation, but there are still so many fundamental and large gaps that are sort of handed down from these initial starting conditions, is the way that I've been thinking about it.
How do they manage to be so, I mean, how does it manage to give a country almost a permanent personality disorder, right? Almost like a cognitive problem that it just can't seem, because I mean, if it were just a legacy that was explicit, mm-hmm. right, and it was still being re-articulated or rewritten or paraphrased or some way to make it be explicit, but it seems to me that it's gone, I mean, let's forget about the Republican Party in its current incarnation, but it seems to have gone underground in many ways, and people don't even know why they're objecting to certain things. Like, for example, the Affordable Care Act, whether it's, or even gun control, they don't know that there's this hidden engine underneath. I mean, how would you divide it up, explicit, implicit? I'm not talking about implicit bias. I'm just talking
Right.
about, do people even know where their ideological commitments come from? And do they know that this is the engine behind so many of their commitments?
So yeah, this is an interesting question that I think part of it, and there's a lot of debate about this in the education world now, is there are a lot of things that Americans are unaware of, in part because of how we teach our history, whether we teach certain things in history. So there's some political scientists who've been studying um, our history curricula, like what gets covered, what doesn't get covered. There have been debates about these standards in our different education boards around the country too. Like that's a big part of it. So some of it is ignorance, but ignorance driven by, again, some direct policy decision. So I remember it was a few years ago, I think it was Texas, there was a debate around one of the history books reframing the history of slavery as like migrant workers coming to America. And so, and that's a way of sort of recasting it in a more positive light. So there's something there, right, of there's this history, do we teach people about it? How are we teaching them about it? There's just some of these decisions that we don't want to confront them. And that's the part that I find really interesting, just looking, most of America was within the US, but when I think about the US compared to some other nations, like that's something I find fascinating, that we try to avoid acknowledgement sometimes of some of these things. And I think about that response in the US versus some other nations, including Germany is one that comes to mind. I spent some time living there as a kid, where they seem more willing to acknowledge some of the past atrocities. Whereas here, it's a big source of debate. Like many people just want to move on. And it's hard to move on without acknowledging and addressing the issues that are still there.
Can I mention two things just in the middle of what you're saying, John, but just in continuation? I just want to first mention this book, which is by one of my favorite philosophers, Sally Haslanger at MIT. It's called Resisting Reality. And it's a collection of her papers. And one of her works is about how the connection between ideology and hegemony. And the difference there is that and she explicitly talks about race. She's a white woman herself, and she has adopted 2 Black kids that she raised, and she's written philosophical papers about their relationships and how that experience went. In her work on ideology critique, what Sally Haslanger says that, John, it relates very closely to what you were saying, is that when ideology is so widespread that it's accepted as state of nature, it becomes invisible, it becomes hegemonic, and people accept it as this is nature. They no longer see it as ideology. And examples that she gives obviously are about race and gender in particular. And with regards to the strategy of counting some humans as less than others, am I back? I
You're back.
For a second.
Yeah.
I would like to mention that in Iran, for instance, the testimony of a woman is worth half the testimony of a man. And if you accidentally hit a woman with a car, you pay half the amount of penalty that you would pay if you pay for a man. And there's some worse things that I'm not going to say about the specific limbs of men and women if they are damaged. What's the amount of like legal sort of dues that somebody has to pay, and sort of just some limbs of men are worth 2/3 of a whole man, while women themselves are 1/3 of a man. So some limbs of men are worth more than a woman.
And these are legal sort of standards. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so you can see, and it's not just Iran. You can also imagine there are other places on earth where this is the case. And I think it's important to note that in these kinds of situations, there is an explicit equation of some accounting for lives, and it enters into law. in Israel, like there is an idea of the present absence. There are people who are absent, meaning their home used to belong to them, but now is occupied by someone else, and they don't have much rights. And so there is some philosophical work that some of my friends at New School had done on the present absence, which is the status of some Palestinians in Israel. In the apartheid, obviously, there was very clear cases of this. Sort of the current situation of immigrants in many places in Europe is like that. Their lives are basically meaningless. And it reminds me, John, also what you said of what Judith Butler was saying about frames of life. And she was talking about the fact that in a war, anyone's life who is on our side is grievable, very massively grievable, a tragedy, the loss of life. But thousands of life on the other side are no longer grievable. They are no longer within the frame of life, like what we would consider what she calls a precarious life that is grievable. And it seems like it's not just about war, but systematically, some lives have been considered more grievable ideologically than others. And this includes not just people of color or women, but also immigrants. So there's different status of the marginalized, of the sort of the subaltern, and to use another term from critical theory. So John, what you said really, as you can see, it really resonated with me and a lot of the kind of literature that I had read. So I really wanted to acknowledge those books. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Mentioned favorites of mine too. I both Judith Butler and Sari Hasmi are fantastic. I guess what I was trying to get at is something really very disturbingly meta, Neil, which is, I was listening to an interview with Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates about what they're about to do at Howard, right? And, Nicole Hannah-Jones was talking about what she went through, and as you know, and we should talk about a little bit, is this vehement attack on critical race theory and what she tried to do. And I'm trying again, and to understand what is this, right? And I think it comes to this idea that the story of American exceptionalism and, this freedom-loving country and the beacon of hope for everyone else, that in a way, sort of having someone, Nicole Hannah-Jones, doing what she's doing, is to just ruin the party, right? Is to just so undermine the myth that how will we ever get on with things again, right? So it's, how dare you bludgeon us with the truth, because you're going to make it so that we will just be like every other country, deeply flawed, and you've basically, through the truth, ruined the idealism. What do you think about that? That it's this idea that, yes, you're telling what you're saying is right, but the price is too high, because then we will be revealed in all our ordinary normalness, right, as another country that can do evil and can do good, and we can't afford that because we're America. So you're ruining it. Is that true?
So there is this sort of existential threat / status threat is how other people who study this characterize it. So the two pieces of or two areas of work that came to mind as you asked the question. One is the political scientist Matt Nelson, whose work I was talking about before, on how we talk about history in our textbooks. One of the things that he's been talking about is how the idea of including a more critical history in our civics education, for instance, that is viewed as a big threat to the society, right? That if we start really talking about this more negative history, then we might end up in a place, people are concerned, we might end up in this place of reverse discrimination. That there's this fear out there that if you really start telling a negative story, it will lead to uprising, and that's not a good thing. That's sort of one piece of the story. There's another related piece on the status threat thing, which is related to sort of the racial hierarchy in the country. So Jennifer Richardson and her colleagues have been doing this research for the past decade now on how, when you talk about sort of the racial representation of the nation, that the U.S. is becoming more racially diverse, that also invokes this threat, right, to the status quo of the country. So there are these fears out there that when you start to talk about these things, people become worried that the very idea of what the nation is under threat. And so that's, I think, part of what's going on.
And so, and just more practically speaking, in terms of, those horrible maps, I mean, obviously I live in Baltimore. I'm very familiar with what that map. What do you think? I mean, just like desegregation of schools, many people have said it was the most successful way of getting education back on track for minorities. So do you think we're going to have a policy like desegregation of schools, desegregation of cities, actually change the architecture and geography of cities, actually impose it top down to reverse this? Is it going to take something like that, do you think? And similarly with healthcare, I mean, are we going to have to do something drastic top down? And so those maps just go away? Because it just seems to me that we're never going to do anything school-wise or city-wise if those maps that you drew just don't change. I mean, it just, it's a nightmare. I mean, do you think there's any way to ruining those maps?
So I think this does pull in some of the work by economists that have, like Sandy Darity, who have really thought about different ways of changing these outcomes. And they do call for what's considered radical solutions like reparations to change some of these outcomes. So one of the things I find interesting is that we've actually been having this conversation for a really long time. I need to pull up the paper to remember the date, but one of the US's first reports on this, major reports on this, was, I want to say it was in the 1930s. And, but the collective ideas was that it would just get better over time, right? So there was, let me find it. Murdahl wrote the report in, when did that report come out? It was in either the 30s or 40s, sort of outlining this problem and what it would take to address some of these issues. And yeah, the collective response was, oh, no, things will just get better. And they clearly haven't. So I do think if we want to make serious progress, there will have to be some drastic solutions. What those are specifically, I will leave that to others who specialize in those areas. I do think I am convinced by some of the arguments that Sandy Darity and others have outlined around why, without some of these drastic policies, like reparations, like changing the funding structure of our schools, and the like, we're just going to keep seeing these maps for another 100 years or 200 years and still have the same conversation that people were having 100 years ago.
So I'll finish with a thought experiment and a personal question, which I'd love to hear, to go talking about maps and gentrification, right? So I was having a discussion with a few friends because, I worked at Harlem Hospital for several years when I was a resident at Columbia. And as you well know, I'm sure far better than I, Harlem has been gentrifying at a rapid clip. Mm-hmm. And I was in a conversation and there was discussions about if I would ever return to New York. John, would you live in Harlem? And I said, no. I said I wouldn't. But you love Harlem. Yes, I really do. But I would like to be invited there by my friends, but I don't think that I should move in, right? So I'm just wondering, if I may ask you, I felt like it's that I would not be doing what it seems like at first, which is celebrating and being an ally, but I'm just part of the problem because a place that is Black identified, has a Black history, is segregated, if I may say, in the proper way, right? Mm-hmm. But I'll move in, I'll get a brownstone, and it'll all be great. And there was that wonderful movie about the 40-year-old, what was it called? The actress, I'll put it in the chat in a minute, but it was this kind of notion. And I was just wondering, if I put you on the spot, would you say to someone like me, yeah, move in, given this whole notion of maps, or in fact, no, don't, right? And be invited. I was just wondering, just flip the map a little bit. Mm-hmm. Given this is happening, I mean, there are all sorts of stories, Portland, nightmare stories about this, what's happening in New York. I was just wondering, we like to have polemics on this show. Should I move into Harlem?
That's a really good question. So this is one of those places where the individual decisions and the collective decisions are tricky to work out. So, because part of the issue is not necessarily just you moving to Harlem. Part of the issue is, well, if you move to Harlem and, other wealthy white people are moving to Harlem in a way that now people who are there have to leave because they can't afford it anymore.
And that's happening. That's happening.
Yeah. So that's a problem. But are there ways of integrating otherwise? Surely, but how does that work? What are the pathways to get there? I don't know.
If I were to go to you, we're not friends yet, hopefully. But if I were to say, Neil, if you had, you had some say, and I were to go, should someone like me move in to these threatened neighborhoods, and they are, right? Mm-hmm. And would you feel comfortable saying, no, actually, I think you probably shouldn't, given the current flow, what's happening? I mean, that would be a piece of radicalism, right? To tell people who consider themselves allies and say, look, no, right? I mean, just say it. I'm just wondering whether that would be a kind of radicalism, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I would love to hear, Ida, what you think about this too, because it's one of the things we're sort of thinking about with individually. I would say, like, I would have a hard time saying no to any one person, right? But it's how do these individual decisions sort of scale up? And one person moving in, buying a house there, increasing the tax base, I think that's great, given all of the things that we know benefit. But when the developer comes in and says, well, I'm buying this block, and all of you need to move out so that I can put up the new high-rise or whatever in Harlem, then clearly that's a big problem. And I see some things in the chat about models of this.
Yeah, so I think that something that's very interesting, Neil and John, is that Andrew in the Ask a Question area asks something that Neil and I actually worked on and recently wrote a paper, and it was interesting, the reviews that we got. So Andrew asks, did Schelling's model of segregation say that it is not possible to 100% rid society of segregation, whatever the basis of segregation is? And I think that it's very interesting to think about Schelling's model, and I'll explain it in a second and put a link for people who would like to get a better idea of it. Thomas Schelling won a Nobel Prize for his work, and he is an economist who in the 70s proposed this idea that's like multi-agent simulation, where you would consider whether you can find very, very simple agent level preferences that lead to macro effects. So the name of his famous book is Micro Motives and Macro Behavior. And the micro motive, John, very similar to something that you were saying earlier, the simple micro motive that he put is that let's say that there's two kinds of nodes in this kind of simulation. Let's say one is black and one is white. And the only thing that they added was that the preference would be, the micro motive is that some percentage of people in my that are my neighbors will look like me. So if you set that to 90%, you get extreme segregation. Even if you start from a very random, combination of all of these dots on a screen, because they have this preference, they're going to move and relocate such that they will get segregated. If you have 70%, 60%, 50%, things will change and they will get mixed. So that's one thing that one can talk about. And using different simulations, changing these parameters, it's possible to sort of figure out what would be the parameters to get rid of segregation. And it has been used to simulate flight in flocks of birds, in fish, swarms, etc., collective behavior. But that's just the mechanics. If that was the actual, thank you, Maxet, for pasting the original Schelling model. I will also add the book. If anybody wants to add the link to the book, please do before I finish speaking. But what I want to say, John, or add to others, is that the important thing that John was saying is not assuming that ending segregation by white folks moving into black neighborhoods is the right solution, right? The question John is asking is very important, actually. He's considering what are the long-term effects, potentially negative long-term effects of this approach to ending segregation, which is not saying we are going to sort of open up the neighborhoods that are better off, that have less aggressive policing, that have better education systems, that have better healthcare, that have better sanitization by the local government. They're not opening those neighborhoods, but they are saying, let's take our more valued members of the society and they go into these neighborhoods that we didn't care about. And if they go there and they have families there, then we will also take the resources that moves with these people. So I think that's the challenge here. And when those resources move with these people, the prices go up and the neighborhood becomes, again, not hospitable to people of color. And again, it's not going to be sort of helpful. That's one scenario that would create the concern. Another is that many people in the Black community think that having mostly Black-owned communities and economies was actually beneficial at some point before radical things happened in Tulsa and other places. There was a Black Wall Street, there were like entirely Black trades. And right now it's impossible to live on entirely Black products because some things are completely corporation oriented. So their concern is that the disappearance of these Black neighborhoods is just going to disempower them as opposed to empower them. So the perspective we have now about segregation, especially I think the book, The New Jim Crow, is very helpful towards this. The perspective we have of segregation is very different than the perspective in the time where fountains were colored and white. At this point, or you couldn't enter a pool if you weren't white or things like that. At this point, the issue is it's not just about where you live. You know, Brooklyn is block by block. It's very different. You have blocks that are completely different block by block. And some of my friends who were teaching in Brooklyn schools, in elementary schools, am I back? Okay. Back. They were shocked at the complete difference from the school that was 3 blocks away. One had robotics and everything, and the other one, children, there was a completely different story, and the children were searched for guns. It was a completely different 2 sets of schools. And I think it's important to notice this, that it's not just about ending segregation. It's not just about it's not as simple anymore, because the long-term effects of that initial micromotive macro behavior has led to institutional memories and institutional changes, including laws that are disproportionately, generationally have affected the communities. And right now the solution is not as easy unless the Black community is empowered. So John's concern is a very important one, in my opinion, and he phrased it very well. And I think that it's not an easy question to answer, and it's a question to contemplate. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about what Neil has to say and John have to say about this.
Yeah, so one quick follow-up on that I'm glad you pointed out was the asymmetries in what movement means. So Black families moving into white neighborhoods, the response is very different than white families moving into Black neighborhoods, right? So, and we've seen that in the past. That was the whole white flight thing, right? Black families would move in, white families would be moving away, and so, and that again led to these continuously segregated cities, and so I do think those asymmetries sort of tie back to what we were talking about at the beginning about initial thoughts about different groups of people and what that means for how we think about when one group moves to and the other's neighborhood versus the reverse direction. They're not equal. Our collective response to them are not equal.
I also think it comes down to this, this paradox that comes up all the time. The extreme is what happened in France, right? Which is they have this notion of universal rights and ideas, and it's so pure that you can't have identity politics because it will then undermine this universal set of principles. And then, of course, you say, well, it's all very well and good to have these universal principles, but the T0 for applying them should be when you don't have huge numbers of disadvantaged groups. Because if you have them already disadvantaged, playing forward on everyone has the same rights is not going to re-equilibrate the situation, right?
Yeah.
So you have to say, and so I think a lot of people go, okay, we'll have the cities desegregated, but then it's a level playing field, and let's forget the past, and we don't see color anymore. It doesn't exist, right? And so that's what I think is the fundamental issue here, is that people think you're not allowed to have your cake and eat it, which is to want to get rid of those horrible color lines in the cities, but also have some protection for communities that have some kind of cultural identity, right? I mean, I have a good friend, talking about Harlem again, there is a very, very popular Black gay venue called Trappier Hour Harlem Reloaded, okay? And it's where queer people of color go. And I remember one day saying, I kind of like to go, right? And this is a really close friend. And he said, no, I don't think you should, right? This is a queer Black space. So I think I'm bringing up these examples just because what we're going to have to accept, I think, politically, is bringing resources and money to everyone rather than concentrating it ever more in a particular set of the population, but also recognize that what Ida was saying, that history doesn't just go away.
Yes.
Right? And say that we should both reverse the nasty sides of history and respect that it happened, and therefore have a way to decrease inequality, but also respect historical neighborhoods that are the legacy of what you did for hundreds and hundreds of years, and not consider one a hypocritical demand because the other should be rectified. And that is what drives me crazy, is it making it look like a zero-sum game. And I think that we can respect both, right? And that somehow the way forward is to see these two things together, protect neighborhoods, respect history, how people came together against oppression, and decrease inequality, and not consider them directly in contradiction. Would you agree with that we can have both?
Yeah, and I think the key thing that you said in that is the acknowledgement of history. Like you naturally get to the zero-sum thinking and the other issues that come from that if you just forget about the history and those starting conditions. But being able to understand them, I think, makes it easier to then acknowledge why we have these feelings and might have these different set of approaches to solving these problems. But you can't get there, I don't think, without the acknowledgement and yeah, long-term institutional and collective memory.
You can't just press a universality button.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think Ida, this is fantastic. I mean, I could ask Neil a million questions. It's like, you could argue that it's the deepest issue that we face, right? But then they look like there are people who might want to come in, right?
Yeah, I want to thank you both. This has been quite awesome. And for anyone who's watching this later on YouTube, there's a lot of links on the right side in the chat that are varying. There's links for various multi-agent simulations. There's a link on a podcast for modern schools. And then John Vore is adding something about kind of a segregation initiative that happened in Chicago. Open library version of micromotives and macro behavior. I'm going to add another one. There's a simulation. It's called the parable of the polygons. For those of you who want to see it in an animated way, that's interesting. Dan Elton is adding the solution of building 100-story high-rises for the rich white people that don't have a big footprint. Yuppie fish tanks. Andrew, there are others who have been asking questions. So there's a lot of things going on in the chat. And Maxted also added a BBC sort of article about changing education outcomes and teachers' grades based on the algorithm that disproportionately downgraded those of a lower socioeconomic class, which are obviously mostly people of color. So very interesting things. And I want to commemorate what John said, which was you can't just press the universality button. I think that is a T-shirt for the that John said.
So,
yeah, go on.
I mean, connecting. I know there are a lot of AI people here, and I will say I'm not an AI person, but I find it topic interesting. And what we're talking about, I think we can sort of bridge to that space in thinking about how these things sort of get baked into these algorithms that then get used to make all sorts of decisions, right? So the point of not having the universality button, when we start building, these machines to sort of learn and predict things moving forward, they're also starting or picking up on what is there from those initial conditions. So I think that's something I would love to hear more about. It's not my area, but it's an area that I try to follow, at least in a lay sense, to understand what's going on.
Hopefully when we get our paper accepted. I invited Maxted to sort of join and discuss. If anybody else wants to discuss their questions on screen, please in the chat let me know. I saw that there was another question and they asked to be asked for them, but Jess, if you would like to join the screen, we would love that also. Andrew, if you are also there, please let us know if you can join the screen. I'll ask you again. Hi, Maxted, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Neil, thank you. That was such a fascinating talk, and it was such an interesting discussion as well. It's just one of the things that blew my mind that I found out recently was that practice of covenanting, especially in I think it was like Pacific Coast cities in the US, where particular ethnic groups were like completely banned from owning property in a neighborhood as well. And the thing about pressing the universality button was really interesting. Like in the UK, in Kensington, we've got one of the most we've got one of the richest neighborhoods in the entire country, where you have some of the most deprived areas as well, literally right next to them. We saw that with Grenfell Tower last year, and that's the thing. Just because that neighborhood, that area isn't necessarily segregated, doesn't mean that the outcomes are equal. And one of the things I was really interested in was that kind of computational element to it, and how do we stop this from seeping into all the things and the models that get built. There was the example earlier from educational outcomes where because all the exams were cancelled in the UK, they asked teachers to predict grades, and then an algorithm downgraded them based on the school's performance in previous years, which disproportionately affected schools that were in lower socioeconomic areas. The other one that's been a big sticking point of where I was a student was the use of Panopto and other like surveillance software for exams that disproportionately affected, again, people of color. So I was really interested, especially in the work that you and Ida did around the modeling of this and some of the things that Ida's linked. I'm going to have a read later. But how do we get to the point where we can, bear in mind there's loads of people in this salon and people that watch this that can have an impact on this. How do we move to more equitable models in the future that start to avoid some of these systemic biases?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the things we're spending a lot of time thinking about and trying to model, but also figure out what are the right inputs to that model. As it turns out to be another tricky piece. So there are different kinds of interventions to address various kinds of biases, and one of the things we need to be aware of, though, first is some of these parameters to begin with. Like what are the elements of bias that are going to lead to the panopto related or the video surveillance issues. Knowing about that allows us to think about how do we set our education policies in the first place to make sure we don't perpetuate that, or if we're going to use that kind of software, what are some other things that we should do to then try to mitigate the effects of those biases. That's sort of one way of thinking about it. But I guess the overall answer, though, is finding out as much as you can about the sources that would lead to the disparate outcomes in the first place, right? Whether that's taking data from your own organization or from experiments that have been run on these topics, but getting some initial set of the parameters that matter and tend to produce these outcomes. And that gives you some starting point for figuring out what are the relevant interventions, because you have to identify the axes in which the biases might manifest and intervene in a way to try to mitigate that. But if you just wait until it happens, then things will just keep perpetuating. So that's the way that we've been thinking about it. And where I think there's value in combining both the computational and behavioral data, which is what we've been working on in our projects together.
That was super interesting. Oh, sorry. I was thinking I've got a bit of a delay on my mic, so apologies. The other one that was really interesting in your talk was the environmental stratification. And I was just wondering, because I think I got the kind of the very high level, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and the way that we think about environmental outputs or outcomes.
Yeah, so that set of studies was about how race and class stratification, again, affects the way that people think about what even counts as an environmental issue in the first place. And the idea is related to how stratification ends up putting people in these clusters. So the neighborhoods, right, it's not just about the conditions of the schools. That tends to also be related to health issues and where other hazards might get put in the neighborhood. Those things tend to cluster together. So, the poorer neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods, those are the places where the landfills get put. Those are the places where if you're going to run a highway through the city, that's where you run the highway. And so the air pollution is worse. All these other things end up being worse in those places. And what we've been finding is when you ask people about sort of environmental issues, what we get is that in the lower income neighborhoods and in the racial minority neighborhoods, people talk about those other things as environmental issues too. Whereas when you ask people who live in wealthier and whiter neighborhoods, like, no. Yes, poverty is an issue. Yes, other forms of inequality are issues, but those are not environmental issues. So because of these sort of multiple forms of injustices, if you will, being very visible to some people because of where they live, they put all of those pieces together, and those end up with a broader conceptualization of what is an environmental issue than people who are in more affluent neighborhoods who don't really see these other issues, and so they have more of a separation between climate change and the ice caps melting and the like, and the other issues. So that's sort of what we've been finding across those studies is because of these forms of stratification, that ends up shaping mental representations of that issue as well.
Sorry, my computer's running so slowly. I do apologize.
No,
There was an interesting thing, sort of thinking about that as well, in terms of, okay, what do I see and what do I see affecting me? And I was thinking about that from two perspectives. The first one was the recent discourse that we've seen around the IPCC climate report, and the thing that I've been thinking about as you say that is that the discourse has been around, is this going to be like, do we need individual solutions to this, or do we need systemic solutions to this?
Yeah.
And as I was kind of thinking about environment and you know, the intersection between race and environment as well, and I'm interested to have a read of that that paper. But what do you think? And I know we were talking about, especially with John and his potential move to Harlem, but what do you think are the kind of key things we can be doing as individuals, both inside and outside the US, and what are the kind of the key systemic things that we need to do, and which ones in your view are the kind of most important?
That's a tough question at the individual level, but I mean, more broadly, reducing our consumption across many domains in wealthier countries, that would help. We keep trying to find these other solutions that would allow us to not really change our consumption patterns, and that doesn't seem to be going very well. So that's one thing. At systemic levels, I mean, this is a place where governments are really important in regulating, because for many of the same reasons that we've been talking about, these become collective action problems very quickly, and so you need large levels of coordination. Setting these targets in these international agreements and actually enforcing them is an important thing to do to try and address some of these issues. Regulating, production sides of the equation becomes important, and those are things that only governments can do. So I think, that's one way that I've been thinking about these issues. But more broadly, to the other point of the connections between these issues and race, class, and the like, for a long time, we've tried to separate them. And in fact, in the environmental movement and the history of that movement, that's another place where it ties back to what we were talking about in the beginning, where there was actually a big division between the mainstream environmental movement, which tended to cater to wealthy white people, and the environmental justice movement. Those started together, and there was explicit decisions that those should be separated, that they are separate agendas to be advanced. That's a problem when you're saying, well, those problems around poverty and racism, like, those are too hard, so we're not going to deal with those. So that's how we ended up where we are today with these massive disparities. So pulling those things back together and thinking about the connections between human welfare and the planetary welfare and the like, and the disparities in that, I think, is an important path forward. And we can't just put, I'm going to keep coming back to John's thing about, we can't just push the universal button because we've set ourselves on this path that created these problems, and we can't just ignore them now. We have to actively work towards pulling them back together.
Can I ask a question? It's a little bit meta again, but it's the late afternoon on a Friday. One of the things that we've had in the Salon a lot, Neil, has been the belief that this isn't just a moral question about representation in any domain, that actually it will solve problems better if you had diversity in every institution and domain. In other words, it's not just, oh gosh, I guess we're going to have to be fair and we're going to have to, it's actually more likely for big problems to be solved if you actually begin to have true representational diversity in the problem-solving crowd.
Yeah.
Right? And I was just wondering, especially with the new census report and, oh my God, do you think, or is this just wishful thinking on my part, that if we actually were able to solve this absurd problem of inequality and segregation and actually got together as a nation and actually did have true educational desegregation and neighborhood desegregation and true representation in the universities, judiciary, in politics. So actually, a country like the US, because it is so diverse, could maybe have a new kind of politics to address things like climate change and these big things. That in fact, as you just implied, maybe one would help solve the other. But if we keep thinking it's going to be the same old heads that are going to solve this problem, right? Well, probably not. Whereas we may end up with a new kind of participatory politics if we actually solve this problem that we have, whether it's women, whether it's color, whether it's queer, and have a new crowd trying to solve the problem, that almost for free, we might get people more interested in getting together to solve the problem, because it doesn't seem like the way we have it all structured now with the kind of people in power we have now, it's just one fuck up after another, right? So, do you think that there could be a subterranean desirable connection between solving the one problem and actually being able to have the proper team to solve the other, that they would go together? Or is that me just dreaming?
No, I think those are absolutely related, and there's a ton of research on this in the complex systems world, showing that as we get more compositional diversity in teams, we get more ideas, we get better ideas, we get many solutions faster. So Scott Page has written a few books on this, sort of summarizing research in that space. But yeah, people in the complex systems world have done lots of research on this. And there are lots of benefits to it. The key thing, though, is not just the compositional diversity, but making sure, back to a point that I raised earlier, that these different groups are actually empowered to really have a voice and have meaningful input and power to help shape some of these conversations. So bringing diverse groups of people together, but then keeping the same power hierarchy, that you don't get as much benefit from that. So composition is one thing, but you also have to make sure then you're not sort of reinforcing those status dynamics in that diverse team. But there is tons of work on that, and I can add some.
Could you add some, because I'd love, you know, because I know it's Scott Page, but I didn't know that he'd written on this in particular.
Yeah, so he has 2 books on this. One is The Diversity Bonus, and then the other one was The Difference. Here's the Diversity Bonus one.
We never learn anything on this, Salon, do we?
There's been a really interesting discourse on this recently on Twitter. I don't know if Dr. Flowers is on the call, but I've been reading some of his tweets on this that have been fascinating about diversity statements and who should they serve. It's not, being in the UK and not having applied for any faculty positions, it's not something I've had to go through, but there's been some really interesting conversations around diversity statements, like you say, as kind of, you know, ticking a box to say, oh, this is what I've done for diversity, right? And whereas you don't have power structures changing that actually make an impact on that. And there's been some really interesting, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but there's been some really interesting things around that. Is diversity ticking, you know, is it ticking a box, or is it doing something to actually benefit the school, the organization, whatever it is? There's been a load of stuff around that as well, around, you know, are we doing these diversity trainings? We've had loads of conversations at where I'm working at the moment. Are we doing diversity trainings to tick a box and say, look, this is what we're doing, or are we using these as an opportunity for people's voices who are not amplified to be heard and actually make some changes?
Yeah, and you know, there's a lot of box checking right now. What should be done is one of the things that I often say to organizations, or I ask them, is like, why are you doing this? Right? Just, you know, you say you want more diversity, like why do you actually want that? And if you don't have an answer to that, then you can quickly end up down the road of just checking boxes for the sake of checking boxes, but nothing ended up changing. And so I think figuring out like what are those broader goals, what benefit do you want from it, can get you to a path where you will end up implementing the right policies and actually evaluating them with the right metrics. That's another piece. So we have a couple of papers on this recently on one thing about diversity trainings is that they're actually rarely evaluated. Most people don't know what it does. You do it and you have your afternoon session, and then you go away and the company has checked the box for the year, but nothing happens. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can do them with intention and ask yourself, well, if we're going to go through this exercise, what do we expect to change? And look at those metrics over time. But yeah.
I feel like honestly, I feel like the whole point of them is to change absolutely nothing. I mean, they are just exercises in, just let's get this done and get on with things. I'm very skeptical. I remember being, I don't dare say this, at Sci-Fu once. I don't know if any of you have been to that. And there was this hip hop for science session, something like that. And it meant well, but everyone in there was white. We got one shot of, Tupac and Biggie. That was like, lasted a minute or two. And then it was just a huge exercise in cultural appropriation. And everyone was clapping and swaying. And it could have come from Norway, right? In other words, I think that these things are, I think, subversive in the wrong way. I don't know what the solutions are, Neil, but I don't think they do much of anything. I don't know what one should do, but maybe there's a way to do it right. I just would like to know if you can send the recipe.
Honestly, I'm very with you, John. I think there's always need for insiders, especially insiders with power, to disrupt. There's no other way. And the disruption will face a lot of obstacles. Like once you actually object to a manel or a white panel or whatever, that's when you realize what the actual structures of powers are. When you object to the smallest thing, that's when you realize what is really going on, the way that that would be treated. And you will see where really people stand, as opposed to, we saw the lightning behind you, John. I think it was your ideas. But you're muted. We don't hear you. You're muted.
When I get riled up.
Yes.
It's a storm thing.
John is disrupting the weather now as an ally. Storm. But so one thing is that I think people who are inside somewhere and reach some position of power, they should disrupt. They should organize to get, like, Harvey Milk was saying, don't mourn, organize. I think that it's important to organize, disrupt, and keep pushing it with taking risks. But there is another thing that I would say, much more specifically, is that there are some universities, for instance, for faculty positions, that do evaluate diversity statements. However, in a case that I saw, they did a blind sort of assessment of diversity statement. And the diversity statement that had won on the pile was one written by a white man who was at Harvard. So when it was a blind thing, because he has learned also how to say things in these things. So it turns into yet another document where the most privileged will know how to angle it in a way that the target audience is going to find it the most compelling. So I think that's another huge challenge. Like the way that I would write a diversity statement would not be probably very appealing to a faculty that's the way that a faculty might think that's predominantly white. John has unmiked, so I want to hear what he says.
No. I think that it's a really good point. I remember when Freddie Gray happened here in Baltimore, and it took there was no response at the university when Freddie Gray was murdered. But when the protests began, then suddenly the university felt a need to have these meetings, these town halls, right? And it was, and you know, my husband at the time, and you know, he's Puerto Rican, said, if you hear at the town hall, we all must come together, burn the hall down, right? And that's exactly what happened. It was, you know, we must all come together. We've all faced hardship, you know, and I did step up and say, you know, why weren't we having this town hall when Freddie Gray died and make it about him rather than saying, oh, take evasive maneuvers. They may burn our cars and our CVSs. Let's cool things down here by all coming together. And I think this is the point that Ida's making, is that this is the move that's always made, is not what can we do for a group that's oppressed, but how can we all show what we have in common? I don't think that's the move, right? What do we all have in common? It sounds nice. We must all come together, but it's not the move. Do you see? And that's what they all feel like to me. It's that we're all in this together. Let's all get along. We mean well. And that seems to me the beating heart of these diversity meetings. Rather than saying there's a fucking problem here, this is really problematic, what are we going to do about it? And until we change the tone, I feel like it will be just like that dynamic I described. We didn't have a meeting about Freddie Gray, but we did have a meetings when the protests started. It's always behind. It's always off base. Do you know what I'm saying?
Also, where is your moral outrage? Like, why is it like, oh, you know, somebody was a crappy advisor and like, you know, assaulted their student. Well, you know, he's very good at getting grants. So, you know, where is the moral outrage? But as soon as there is something like, okay, cancel this person because he's a racist, oh, the moral outrage shows up. You can see people's priorities when they have this gut reaction that like erupts in terms of a moral outrage. And there was a philosophy paper. There are two philosophers, father and son, who have the same last name. I'm trying to remember his name. About the reactive attitude, the moral reactive attitude and moral accountability, and how resentment is related to that. You cannot resent a child for accidentally dropping something or not holding a promise because they're not developed yet. They're not a full adult. You cannot resent a person who has severe mental challenges for, you know, cursing at you. You can understand it to some extent. There is like a sense in which the moral accountability and responsibility is not complete because that person has been either compromised because of a severe mental illness or is a child, has not even developed the ability to tell right and wrong yet. And if people keep not showing the right moral accountability and not showing the right moral attitude, it seems like they're just exiting the category of being moral agents in my mind. They are gaining that status of, they cannot gain the status of a mentally ill person. That's why I don't like people who call racists mentally ill. So it's not a mental illness, it's a choice. This is not something you were born with. Oh, I was born.
Although it's an interesting issue, it comes back to the beginning. I do consider it a kind of, and I mean this, you know, as a neurologist, I do think it is a kind of cognitive disorder. I really mean that. I'm not trying in any way to, I totally agree with you. That doesn't absolve, and actually a good friend of mine in Baltimore gets really annoyed at me when I say that because it seems to be letting people off the hook. But I do think that, you know, at the intersection of, you know, politics, psychology, you know, AI, there is something about it. I do think that that it leads to a kind of cognitive state, whether it's the films you see, the TV shows you see, the conversations you hear, the neighborhoods you live in. It does have a training effect on the brain. I think it does. And it's very
mental illness. Training the brain is the same way that you and I learned math. We went somewhere. I wasn't.
You learned it a lot better than I did.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
You're being too kind. But it's just that, yes, some of us have more inclination, either because of our families or whatnot, because my dad was very good at math, so maybe that was the reason that I was more interested in it. But I wasn't born knowing math the way that I know now. And I don't mean just the ability to count and these kinds of things. No, I mean, I wasn't born knowing differential equations. No one is born knowing differential equations.
No, I'm just saying that I'm just saying that whatever we do, I'm just saying that I think all the things that Neil talked about at the beginning is there's been this multifaceted, multi-dimensional, similar position trained into the psyche, and every single domain of existence has it in there, whether it's where you live or what you learn or all those things. And I'm just saying it's going to require some kind of massive counter strategy to sort of learn our way out of it. And I guess I'm just saying that to learn our way out of it is going to require a lot more methodological, subversive, long-term work than a few diversity sessions every now and then when there's an event. It's just pissing in the wind, right? I just don't think it's going to work. So it's not just the content that's wrong. It's the idea that that's going to be enough. Yeah. It's just not, wouldn't you agree, Neil? It's just not enough. I mean,
and the idea that, oh, we did a lot. It's over. Like, there was a year, and in this year we said the right things. Like, it's over. It's not the time anymore. Let's get back to business.
Yeah, I mean, it's I do agree here, and we've written some things on this, that the single shot afternoon session approach to undoing 30 years, 40 years, 50 years of learning these biases, what else would we expect? In what other case would we expect that to produce a large change? You need much more than that. But I think that there's another thing that was discussed in this conversation that I think I wanted to return to, about the reactivity later. And that part of that is, I think people end up in these situations where part of why it takes them a long time to respond is the implication that, well, I've been doing everything like right all along, so if something wrong is happening, that means I must be a bad person or something like that. And I think people get caught into that mental trap too, which is part of why we see some of these defensive reactions and less of a willingness to make big changes, because the idea that big changes are necessary means there's something wrong with me and something wrong with my organization, and that evokes this sort of defensive, these kinds of defensive processes. But they're all stemming from those same, we want to keep with the learning models, accumulation of like what you've learned about yourself and what is good, and like that initial set of starting conditions would lead to those mental processes. Sorry. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I just want to also highlight what Jess Thompson says in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to read it, actually.
It's very important. She says, the current discussion seems to reflect the idea that racist ideas lead to racial inequality. I imagine many here are familiar with Ibram X. Kendi's work, who talks about the sources of racial inequality being self-interest. That self-interest leads to inequality, which is then justified and maintained with racist ideas. Jess, we really hope you could join the screen. I know in your question you said you wouldn't, but if you reconsider, let us know. Go ahead. Oh, Neil, I think this is for you.
No, I totally agree with that.
I also agree with it, and it's a great point. And I think what we are discussing is both. That also in the computational work that Neil and I were talking about, we really focus on situations where it's not that individuals are necessarily worse than others. Population is actually similar in terms of their dispositions and macro behavior, but we show how the structure of situations can lead to that. So it's also a little different from Ibram X. Kendi's work in the sense that we also focus on how the way that we structure our institutions can lead to even non-race, I mean, I don't know if this is non-racist, but even computationally, hypothetically, theoretically, if we had totally non-racist and non-sexist, as in the probability of being cruel to the other side was the same across the populations, we would still end up having disparity and inequality. So I'm glad that Jess brought that up.
And it's for some of the reasons that we're also talking about here. And one way that I think about it as an intervention person is the dose response, right? That part of when things are already starting off at so far apart, one dose is not going to be enough to get us back to equality. And so one of the things that's been nice to be able to model is to figure out just how many rounds of interventions you would need continuously to get back to an equilibrium. That if you just do the session one time, that's just not enough. And that's one thing that I find really helpful with the computational modeling approach to try and figuring out some of these things.
And that's a really good, I mean, getting back to this, notion of, racism as analogous to a chronic illness. I've written recently about the fact that, on the one hand, we have a medical model where we love magic bullets. And the vaccine has been a great example of that, right? You can really, in a year, make something that you give once or twice and it's effective. But what we've not been very good at is all the people with the chronic illnesses, whether it's frailty, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, inactivity, that made them susceptible to dying or being severely ill from it.
Yep.
So we don't know what the solution is to chronic illness. What doesn't work is one dose of anything, right? We don't have a 10-day course of penicillin for strep throat, for CHF or diabetes or any of those things. And so what we need is long-term behavioral intervention. But we're useless in the medical profession at that. We are. You don't get taught behavioral intervention. You don't get taught multimodal top-down intervention. So in other words, just like we don't know what to do with chronic disease, we don't know what to do about this bigger problem because we're not good at long-term solutions. And then, of course, there's a subterranean connection between those because lots of minorities are the ones who have the biggest burden of chronic disease because we have no interest in trying to do anything about these long-term problems. So we need a total change in what we think is a meaningful intervention. And basically, a session on diversity is basically talk therapy as a pill. Let's just do it once or twice, antibiotic our way out of trouble, right? Doesn't work, right? So there are some things that we're just useless at solving, which is long-term, high-dose, high-intensity behavioral intervention. Same with rehabilitation.
Or
right? How we're going to teach it.
Or even thinking about the fact that multiple things might be necessary. So, the place that I see value with some of the initial afternoon sessions is starting a conversation, like raising some awareness of some of these issues, but it can't stop there, right? And that's, if we want to keep drawing the analogies to medicine, the patient comes to see you with some chronic illness. You might have some initial recommendation that you make, but depending on what the illness is, you might also recommend a lot of other lifestyle intervention changes, right? So whether it's spending more time, whether it's changing diets, whether it's changing exercise regimens or something else, there are other things that you have to keep doing to improve and maintain your health. It can't just be the one-off thing.
Neil, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work you've done recently that relates very directly to what John is saying on the kinds of interventions that might have longer term sort of effects. Because I remember the talk that you gave at MSR, people were very interested in those aspects. Because I think, John, something that's very important about Neil's work is that he actually says, hey, let's try this out and see the effect. And he's not the only person. There's like meta reviews and everything. Let's take a look at these interventions that they talk about, sensitivity training, etc. And then when you measure behavior before and after, you can see that the effects don't even last like 48 hours. Like it's just, forget about it.
Yeah.
Or even 24 hours in some cases. So, yeah, not even 24 hours. It's like immediately after I tell you be nice, you can behave nice. But then tomorrow you've forgotten about it. And the other thing is, for instance, the research that have been done in social psych on contact. The idea is, oh, people are different, just bring them together and have a coffee and everything is going to be resolved. It's like, yes, if I meet one person once in order to be nicer, okay, I think my screen goes off when my mind gets when I get frustrated. So if I meet someone only once as a kind of acquaintance to another group, I can behave. The point is, if you talk to them over a long period of time, when the differences show up, how do you communicate your challenges? How do you resolve sort of challenges? How do you resolve contentions? How do you respect the other people's time? And how do you not dump lower work on them and claim certain things? How do you not take ownership of their ideas? Do we have all of this covered also? How do you not insult them in your assumptions of the universal button and things like that? I think that the not having done longitudinal work on even contact, as far as I know, Neil, maybe there is something I don't know. I think that kind of brings this challenge. We just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the research literature overall just focuses mostly on single shot interventions. So that's mostly what we know. And, as I was saying, there's some things that that is useful to know. Again, if you want to change, if there's only one time in which what you do matters, then maybe preparing for that one event, don't be a jerk to this person that you're meeting for this time. Maybe that's enough. But if you want to create lasting behavior changes, then you do have to do more. And the work that has been done on the longer term changes are these more intensive interventions that take a long time. So there's one set of studies out of Wisconsin, for instance, on the prejudice habit model, which I think is actually a really good way of thinking about it, that prejudice is a habit that we have formed over our lifetime for the reasons that I've been talking about. And if you want to change those behaviors, then you have to break that habit. But part of what that work does is many, if I remember correctly, they brought people back in every other day for 2 weeks, right? That's very intensive training to sort of change mental representations, give people behavioral strategies that they can practice, notice their changes in behavior, repeat sort of that cycle. And over time, people do change. Some of the work that I've been doing in the education space, they're again very high touch interventions where we're changing features about the structure, first of all, because of the starting conditions that we're talking about, providing resources to students, providing mentorship and the like, and we get long-term large changes in behaviors and outcomes. So again, you really have to think about what is the thing you're trying to change. So that goes back to what we were talking about, I don't know, I guess half an hour ago or so. What is the thing? What is the outcome you're trying to change? And what are all the things that lead to those outcomes? If it's a simpler thing, be nice in this one interaction, then maybe you can do a simpler intervention. But if it's a larger constellation of behaviors you want to change, or you want to change the culture of your organization, for instance, that's another thing. Companies will say, oh, we want to change our organizational culture. Okay, let's talk about what that means. That's a big ask. That will require a different set of strategies. If you want to change the way that your patients are living their lives, right? That requires a lot of mapping on what are they doing in their day-to-day lives, what are the various forces acting upon them, and then coming up with interventions that would change those things. So, overall, I think there's a lot of utility in doing, what we call, in sort of my lab and others use similar approaches, but this sort of behavior mapping to figure out what are all the forces acting upon a person that would lead to these behaviors. And then that provides useful insights for figuring out what ingredients do you need in an intervention to then try to change those behaviors. And bringing in a reinforcement learning element to this, what would you need to sort of keep reinforcing those things over time? Because the single dose is rarely going to do it. if we want to keep going on the vaccine metaphor, you need boosters along the way, right? And so figuring out when do you need those boosters, how strong do those boosters need to be, all of those things are useful to think about to try to make these long-term lasting changes.
I think those are great points. And related to that, Ella in the chat says there is the term behavioral homeostasis, an organism's tendency to maintain stability or equilibrium through various behavioral processes. And one could think about behavioral homeostasis that happens in institutions. And so the ways in which an institution might resist the kinds of change that we are talking about, and it might be helpful to study and understand them and model them so that we can kind of predict and kind of find the optimal ways to get through it. Another thing that I want to do is read Jessa's question, who asked us to read the question for her. She says, thanks for the talk. I'm wondering if you've done any research on historically Black colleges and universities, or if you have any comments on the effects of segregation there. Very good question.
Yeah, I haven't done any research yet at HBCUs. We have one project that was about to launch before the pandemic, and then it has been delayed. But most of my work has been in the context of predominantly white universities. Well, there was a second part of that question, though. Can you repeat the second? Yeah.
The second part of the question is,
if
you have any comments on the effects of segregation in HBCUs, basically, whether it's helpful?
I don't think I have a comment without more sort of elaboration on the question, I guess. But the broader point is, because most of my work has not been in that context, I think
it relates. I think the question relates a little bit to what I was saying when should I move into Harlem? I mean, should we have HBCs, right? In other words, are they a contradiction with respect to desegregation and the universal button, but again, the word history is in there, right? And
the history and the contemporary implications, right? So one of the, and it goes back to a point that I had raised earlier about the protective nature of being in spaces where you're, at least for a moment, not being bombarded with all of the other shit in the world, right?
Yeah.
That there's value in that. There's value in having strong communities that where there are people like you helping to support and build you up, and so I think they have great benefits.
And this has come up with women's colleges and schools for girls, and maybe in some infinite future when none of these things exist, but in the meantime you need safe spaces, right? I mean, it just seems absurd to think not, right? I don't understand, nor do I think the existence of safe spaces in any way contradicts a broader policy change, which with all the things that you say, right? They're not somehow contradicting each other. I think that's a false thing.
Yeah, and the other, just quickly on the safe space thing, another way of thinking about many of these institutions is that for a long time they were safe spaces just for a different group, and so we're arguing we're arguing about the arguments about safe spaces as if they're something new. That's not the case. There have always been safe spaces in many of our institutions. It's just, who were they safe spaces for? That is really the question.
There's a point here as well that. Oh, sorry, Ada, go ahead.
No, actually, go ahead. I just wanted to read the next question, but you go ahead.
So there was a quote that it says something like, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I think it links into this whole idea that so I saw recently, you might have guessed from the underground train in the back, but I'm a bit of a nerd about trains as well. And they've got a great thing at the moment in the UK where they'll especially during Pride Month, and now carrying on outside of Pride Month, they will paint trains in rainbow colours in support of LGBT plus Q plus causes. And someone posted something like, "Oh, when are we gonna have a train in straight colours?" And there was a whole big dispute about this as well. But this, I think, is the point: is that I think that in order to get to a more equitable stage, people are going to have to recognize that they've had those safe spaces in elite research institutions, right? And they're going to have to recognize, and this is linking into Thomas's question, which I thought was really interesting, around should I say no to that tenure track position, is that is at some point, and again, Ida's point around disrupting when people are at the top, it's the people at the top that are in those positions of privilege usually have got there through luck or their social background, the people they know. And John's point as well, the one that you mentioned earlier around if they say, oh, we all need to come together, the people that are saying we all need to come together are the people that benefit the most from everyone ignoring the oppression they've had, right? So this is the thing, is right, is at what point do people, and I'm well aware of this, being a straight white male, is that I've a big part of mine is that I recognize where I'm at has been hugely benefited by my background, by my privilege, what I've got to. But the problem is that there are so many people at the top that do not get that. And then the next question is, well, okay, how do we? And I know it's not just a one dose, because the people that are organising these one-off dose sessions, just to say, tick, there we go, done, are the people that need to understand it the most. And that I think is where we need those longer term ones.
So I have to go in a minute. But I will say that the Salon is multiple doses, right? And we've been dosing for a year. I think that it's been very much about conversations like this. And you know what I love about these conversations? I can guarantee you that there are probably not people listening, because we have a crowd that are like-minded, but I can guarantee that there are many people who will be very irritated by this discussion.
Oh, I'm sure.
And really feel like it's not needed. But I would like to say, to Maxted's point, that we are going to start having more people at higher doses and high intensity talking about this more and more. And it's by having venues like this and promoting people, because, we're going to get the names of young faculty. You're an assistant professor, right? And say, look, this is going to be our next full professor, and have new assistant professors. And, it does make a difference, right? So I think if we were just to do this once and not fight every week, it would be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and before we go, sorry, I want to just make sure that John has to go soon. I just want to make sure that I get all of you all's comments on this one. Thomas says, alternative poll to John's poll, which is below, and people are 50-50 whether John should buy an apartment in Harlem or Brownstone. I say he should, and should let me live in it, but that's okay. He says, I'm a white male in a white male dominated field. I'm offered a tenure track position at a white male dominated department. Should I take the job? Meaning, try to disrupt from within or give way to others. Gentrification seems such a large problem that an individual's behavior may have less impact, but given the state of the job market in academia, ... What do you guys think about that? John and Neil, as our outro question.
John, go first.
Oh, thanks, Neil. I think that's really hard, right? I really do. Because quite honestly, in that situation, you need to ask why he was offered the job, right? In other words, who is there offering the job, right? So I think it's a bit much to have this person do the sacrifice, but maybe, And then the second thing I would say is, I'm not sure if I were in that position that I would want to even go to that university, quite frankly. In other words, I would probably just not want to go, right? If that were really the case, that I was joining an all-white, all-male faculty, I think I'm being quite honest that I would not be interested, right? And if I felt like I was good enough to get tenure, then I think I could probably get it somewhere else, right? Or take up a fight somewhere else. So I think there are ways to sort of frame that question where you can go, well, who was offering you the job? would you really want to go to that place? And without saying to that person, you're a moral coward if you take the job. I don't know what's happening in their lives, the money they need and what they've gone through. So but I think one should question whether one really would want that job in that place with the people who seem to be choosing people like themselves over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is, again, not knowing more details about your personal situation, is you can ask that question to the department if that's something that does bother you. Like, why is it that everyone here looks like me? And are there any plans to change that in the future? And I mean, that's something that you can raise as a concern. I mean, it's a higher stakes version of the Mantle situation that we talked about earlier. And those are decisions that we can make. But, I will accept this offer under the condition that these plans are, put into place. We have when you're in positions of power in negotiations, you can decide what you use that power for. And if this is an important issue to you, I think that's something that you can raise with the chair or whoever's handling your negotiations, that you would like to come here if that's if you do want to go there. But this is something that's important to you, that you'd like to know what the plans are, and for there to be some commitments to future hiring that would change that trajectory.
And that was in his question too, exactly to your point, which was, should I be subverting from the inside? I think that those people...
It's not so easy. It's not so easy. Let me just add that. If you are in such an area, such a place, they will completely overrule that. Like, it's not at all easy to do change from inside as an assistant professor, unless that department hires a cluster of a number of minorities. It's not even going to be a safe place to be for a minority faculty, because and also we know that retention wouldn't be great. Some analysis that Neil has shared before is that a lot of places, they have some percentage Black professors, but it's actually not the same people over the years. They keep replacing them. So retention is not that great. And
no, I mean, one of my best friends has just been made, he's the only Black male partner at a very prestigious law firm in New York. And, they say, oh, well, we've had people like you before. Right? Oh, but there's no retention. Now, sometimes that may be because it was a stepping stone to something better, but usually it's just the conditions are not that enjoyable. I mean, I think the key to it, really, to that question, is insist for your first faculty job to be a full professor. I have to go. Look, this has been really a pleasure. Neil, honestly, I hope we talk more. Ida, thanks for hosting. Max did, thanks. You took the Jovo position and you look good there. All right. Take care, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
It was great to talk.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, so before we leave, I guess I just want to first thank you, Neil, very much. I want to thank also John and the audience for a very great participation. I also want to thank Eva and Claire, who behind the scenes have been helping us, especially now that Jova is on vacation. I want to thank also Worldwide Neuro, who's allowing us to run these on their platform, and it's pretty awesome. And there was a lot of food for thought today, I think, and I very much appreciate that we discussed learning that's a kind of biological learning, but it's very pertinent to our lives, and very happy to have had a social psychology / communication kind of direction as well. If anybody wants to sort of ask any other questions, obviously feel free to send us emails or tweets. And Neil, we would like to give the last words to you.
Oh, well, I just thank you all for inviting me. Thanks to everyone that came and participated. I really enjoyed the discussion. And I guess my final word is that this should not be the end of this discussion. That to John's point before he left, this is a space where these discussions can continue, but also in the rest of your lives. This is something that you can be talking about at work, at home. Now I realize we didn't talk about the developmental research in the space, but having these conversations with your children affects their attitudes later in life. So these are conversations that we can be having in many parts of our lives, and that can make a difference. It can't just be a one-time thing. So I guess that's my final thoughts.
Thank you. Very good points. So remember, everyone, talk to each other, talk to your kids, your grandkids, your grandparents. All right. I look forward to the next Salon, which we are still going to go back into our summer holiday mode, and hopefully we will restart it with the new semester. And maybe it will be half in person or once a month in person. We are not sure yet. Maybe we will have a New York location at the Microsoft Research Office, and some of us can gather in person and some of us can remote. Let's see. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Take care.